We're thinking about how to model how firms behave in a marketplace. We've done a lot thinking about how firms maximize profits. We've thought about how consumers are or their behaviors captured by the demand curve. We know about costs at the firm. We know how that will translate into the firm's optimal decision. But now we have to bring markets to play. And in order to do that, you need to think about something that economists call market structure. If I took two firms and gave them identical factories, identical costs, everything's the same, their demand curves are the same, but one of the firms is the only firm producing that product, whereas the other firm is one of 10,000 firms producing that product, you've got to know that their decisions are going to be wildly different. Okay? So we need to somehow bring together these forces of competition, the external competition on the firm, which constrains what the firm does with its own cost curves and, thinking about the demand for the product that it's selling. So in a way, we're going to think of this market structure as sort of, let's call it the competitiveness of the industry. And there's a lot of ways you can think about competitive. But for us, a good proxy is really going to be the number of firms. That story I just told you, 10,000 firms, is going to have a market outcome that's much different than one firm, which is also going to have a market outcome, by the way, that's different than 5 firms. So we're going to think about what happens when we vary the number of firms. And so I'm going to draw this number line. And this number line shows the number of firms. And on one side, at this polar extreme, we have something with one firm, and we call that a monopoly market. And we'll spend some time, quality time, figuring out how a monopolist actually operates and what happens in a monopoly outcome. At the other side, we've got N, where N is a very large number. Okay? And we're going to call that perfect competition. And you'll see why I put the word perfect in there in a minute. It's a competitive market, but it's a very special type of competitive market. Because we've got these polar extremes here, I'm going to really take advantage of that and make them polar. Monopoly is the only game in town. Competition is not only competition, but it's a perfect form of competition, and you'll see what I mean in a few minutes as we slog through this. So what we're going to do in this module is think about how we find an equilibrium in a perfectly competitive market. Now, by the way, before we leave here, I should say that this middle zone, okay, where there's more than one, but not that many, is what we call oligopoly. And oligopoly is a little bit harder. We're going to get to that after we build these polars. The poles sort of allow us to set out straw men that sort of have extreme points, and then we'll tip our toes in the water of a little bit messier world where you have maybe 2 or 3 firms who are really big, but they know a lot about each other, and there's all sorts of interaction in that particular situation. Okay, so to begin with, let's start about perfect competition. And the way economists think about perfect competition is not to give you a definition. They give you conditions. That if these particular conditions, and there's going to be 4 of them, if these 4 conditions hold, then we know what the outcome is going to look like. We understand what the equilibrium will be in that market. So let's go through these 4. Let's go through these 4 conditions. And by the way, fact is that I said that we're using perfect here. We're setting this up so the assumptions are going to be what scientists might call restrictive assumptions. They're going to be pretty hard to meet these assumptions, but if we meet them, we're going to have this great outcome. Okay? So let's start with the first condition. And the first condition says we need a large number of relatively small buyers and sellers. Now, the key here is relatively small. They might not be small in the real world. Some of the largest companies in the world are oil companies. You find them regularly in the top 10 of the firms in the Fortune 500 or top 20. But economists, for the most part, think these oil companies are pretty competitive. They're very big relative to other firms. But on the other hand, there's a lot of them all about the same size, and they sort of duke it out on. And so in that sort of situation, we can say they're relatively small buyers and sellers. Nobody really has market power. Notice, we also want this to be not just relatively small sellers, that's because I've been talking about the firm, but we also want a large number of relatively small buyers. Because if you have a market where one buyer is particularly large, that can sort of disrupt the outcome. have some strange things. You think about vaccines, biologics in the United States. There's one buyer of vaccines in the United States that's really quite large relative to everybody else. That's the federal government, or government in general. Federal and states buy lots of vaccines. Okay, so that really changes the way the market works because there's one giant player wading into the market. We don't want that here. We want to just think about what economists call atomistic buyers and atomistic sellers. There's just lots of them out there, and they're relatively small. We'll come back in a minute and talk about some of these things. Second thing, homogeneous products. And since we've already stepped on this ground and talked about we're really going out on a pole and making some pretty restrictive assumptions, we're going to say identical products. Now, there are a lot of products that are identical. Number 2 red winter wheat is number 2 red winter wheat. Saudi Light is a certain grade of crude that lots of people make Saudi Light. It just doesn't come from Saudi Arabia. So there's products out there that meet this. What we're avoiding here are products that you may think feel competitive, but there's a little bit different. For example, toothpaste. There's 37 different flavors of toothpaste on the shelf. They got some sparkles and some don't, and some have cleaning, all these sorts of things. It's a pretty competitive business, but on the other hand, the fact that they're not homogeneous, they're heterogeneous products, can introduce something economists call brand loyalty. And that can change everything in terms of the outcome. So we're going to rule those out right now. We're talking about really a generic product. Third, free entry and exit. Now, we don't mean here that it's costless. I mean, if you want to enter the industry, you're still going to have to buy a plant, you're going to construct a factory or something like that. What we mean by free is that there's no restrictions against entry. If you want to come in, you can come in. You know, most industries are like that, but some aren't. Here in Champaign-Urbana, where I'm getting this being filmed today, there's a limited number of liquor license in something that we call the campus town area, where the students hang out all around. And these liquor licenses, there's just a limited number of people who get them. Now, lots of people would like to put a bar in Champaign-Urbana because there's 40,000 students here. But they're limited in the number of bars because the city sort of has this idea that we shouldn't have too many of them, so they just have a limited number of licenses. That would violate this Rule 3, okay? The outcome in that market is not going to look competitive because of restricted access to being a seller in that market. We also don't want to have barriers to exit. In the past, some market economies have placed restrictions that said that you need to have, I mean, it's not unusual in history of these markets, especially in Europe, to have some constraints on some industries that would say that you have to give advance notice of as much as 180 days of layoff. Well, if you have to tell workers 180 days in advance before you're going to lay them off, that makes it pretty hard to get out of that industry. Exit is very difficult, and that's going to change the way you behave in that industry. We don't want that. Just right now we're assuming that way. And the fourth and final condition is something called perfect information. Okay, perfect information is just as it says. It means that everybody knows everything there is to know about this. Nobody's confused. All right, that's kind of a restrictive assumption. In the real world, we might not have that good information, but let's think about these conditions for a moment. As I said, they're very restrictive. Do we have any industries that fit these? Well, not a lot that fit them this closely, but there are some. Here in central Illinois, we think of, for example, corn farming as an industry that pretty much fits this. There are lots and lots and lots of relatively small corn farmers and lots and lots and lots of people who buy corn on the board of trade and on the market. Okay, the product, field corn is field corn. It's a pretty homogeneous product. The corn that we make here is the same they make in Canada. It's the same they make in Brazil. It's a product. Free entry and exit. People can start producing corn. They can say, my farm used to be, majority of my farm was soybeans. Now I'm going to put more in corn. Here in central Illinois, we have some farms that are just pumpkins and gourds. Maybe they could just convert those into corn too. So there's lots of ability to become a member of this industry or to leave this industry. Perfect information. One of the things that happens when you get people from the East Coast to the West Coast who arrive here as new faculty members, we have about 2,000 faculty members in this campus, and if they come from the East Coast or West Coast, it won't take them more than a couple weeks in town, and they'll turn and say, how many times a day do they announce the price of corn? Well, it turns out the price of corn is important around Champaign because corn is really one of the major products in Champaign County. It's a very big farming community around here. And so there's lots of information about what's happening in the corn market. There's lots of information about how to produce better corn, the advertisements. You're watching basketball games on TV at night in the East Coast. I'll bet you don't get 16 different corn commercials like we do here in Central Illinois during those games. Okay, one last step, and then we're going to be done with this part. Essentially, if you think about it, the implication of these four things is that firms are price takers. And what's that mean? Well, it means that firms are so small that they have to take prices given from the market. The individual farmer cannot just say, hey, I'm tired of $3.20 corn. I want $4 corn. The market will say, I'm not going to buy your corn for $4 when I can buy a lot of other people's corn who buy condition 2, looks the same, and they're selling at market price. So in markets like this, firms, because of the large number of other people selling the same type of products, essentially they're unable to set their own price. They have to take the market prices given. And that's going to be important as we go forward.